Hi, my name is John McClelland, biological technician here at Redwood National Park, and I'm talking to you today about the use of girdling as a tool for oak woodland and prairie restoration. So the use of girdling here at Redwood National Park has been occurring since the 1980s to manage encroaching Douglas fir in our oak woodlands. So girdling is low cost. It could be taught in a short period of time. It doesn't require a great deal of skill, especially if you're using just an axe, and it's most often the only means to safely kill a conifer. So what does removing the bark do to the tree? Basically, girdling is the process where you disrupt the living connection between the roots and the leaves by chopping away the outer and inner bark, or the cambium layer. Technically, you sever the phloem, or the vascular tissue that carries the products of photosynthesis from the leaves to the roots. Therefore, girdling starves the roots of nutrients, and the tree will die over time. So why girdle? Well, there's some situations where it may be advantageous to girdle, like to remove competition from encroaching conifers that may be overtopping your native oaks. Often the large tree has a large spreading crown that over time will shade out and kill the oak, like in the photo there. So also, felling large trees would likely damage many of the smaller oaks. In this case, girdling will retain the trees and prevent or reduce the damage to the smaller trees when the large tree finally comes down. And hopefully after you girdle, it will turn into a snag and not that large spreading canopy that was once there. So when the snag comes down, there's a lot less impact to your oaks. The second situation might be if the stand is very dense and the crowns are all interlocking. Falling the tree would result in a hung tree requiring a great deal of work and added risk to bring it to the ground. That photo clearly illustrates the one on the left, a large diameter conifer growing up amongst the oaks. It would likely damage the oaks if you try to put that on the ground. Also, some of these very large wolf trees that were open grown at the time, they grow very fast and very large. They may be on the skill level of the faller to bring to the ground. Also, falling multiple trees would add an unacceptable amount of biomass on the ground that may have to be mitigated prior to prescribed burning. So you wouldn't want to add much more biomass in these two photos. So girdling might be a good option in this case. And finally, you may want to leave some trees as dead stems to use by birds, such as woodpeckers or flickers, that require nesting cavities. It's like a delicatessen. There's a lot of insects in those snags. So techniques that we use for good girdling, all those tools in the photo we've used here at the park, from a big falling saw for the largest diameter conifers to an arborist saw, which works really well. It's lightweight, also cuts through the thick bark really well. My favorite, though, is just a single-bitted axe for the smaller diameter trees. It gets through the bark really well. You don't have to haul around gas or oil. I've actually used an arborist hand saw, which works well just because it's light, but you still need to take an axe out to remove the bark. And the bark spuds are specifically for after the cuts are made on the girdle to remove the bark in between the horizontal cuts. So for timing, girdling can be done any time of the year, but to avoid frustration and extra labor, the spring and summer is really the best time. When the sap is running, the nutrients are flowing through the cambium and the phloem to the roots, and it acts as a lubricant. So that's the best time, though you can winter girdle. As you can see in the right photo, that was about an 8-inch tree, but look how much of the holding wood I had to remove, get through the cambium. So a lot more labor involved. So when to use an axe and when to use a chainsaw? Generally, the thickness of the bark and the diameter of the tree will determine when to use either. The larger diameter trees can be done with a chainsaw, basically because they have more mass to maintain their structural integrity as the tree dies. With thinner bark trees, really an axe is all you really need to do, because you're not going to cut through much of the holding wood. And if you do it during the spring or summer, that bark will pop off really easy. So how to girdle? Basically, I approach a tree that I'm going to girdle the same way if I was going to fall it. I want to size it up, look for any aerial hazards above me. I want to clear the work area around the tree. I want to cut and remove the limbs from around the tree to have full access to the bole of the tree. And then I want to choose a location where the bark will be removed. And it's easier to remove the bark in between, the knots where the branches were once located. It's a lot easier to get around the tree and do that way. So first, what you want to do, and I just want to point out there's lots of techniques to remove bark around the tree. I only like to go around the tree one time, so I don't go around twice, making the top cut and the bottom cut. I can do that just standing in one place by hitting, the top and bottom cut, and then even remove the bark at the same time in that little section. But basically you want to end up with, an upper and lower horizontal cut, and then, a vertical cut to go through all the way through the bark, and then start peeling it off. And you don't want to leave any strips of bark or cambium layer attached inside your top and bottom cut. That tree will try to heal over at that spot and the tree won't die. So you want to make sure that everything is removed, and if it's, again, during the spring or summer when the sap is running, that bark should pop right off at the point where you've got this nice smooth inner layer there. And the ratio, just as a rule of thumb, you can go 1 to 1. So if it's an 8-inch tree, you want to do an 8-inch wide girdle. And so there's actually ways not to girdle. And as you can see in the left photo, they used a saw or maybe even a hand saw, and they went too far into the holding wood to make their horizontal cuts. And that will weaken the tree. It might fall over even before it dies. And then the right is also something that happens when you use a chainsaw. You make your bottom horizontal cut, and they went too far in, and then you just make a series of vertical cuts with the bar of the saw, and they actually tapered it in. So again, that really weakens the tree, and you really don't want to do that technique. So what are the considerations for girdling within a prescribed fire burn unit? So after you girdle, you can see some of the stages of decline as it turns into a snag. This can vary over a period of time depending on the diameter of the tree and the actual site. But what we've seen here in the park is 12 to 18-inch diameter Doug fir. You should have red needles on it within 2 years. And then within probably 6 years, it would be at stage 3. So the big disadvantage for us is you're creating a hazard in the woods. That's the bottom line. When you fall a tree, it's stable once it hits the ground, but when you girdle it, it's going to stay in place and die. And, that's one consideration. If you do a whole bunch together, then you have what would be, there on the slide on the left, a whole little group of snags. And so something you need to consider. And then on the photo on the right, we've come back after we girdled a few trees and we're cleaning up some other biomass. You've got a crew working there next to snags. So just want to point that out to anyone working near snags. And then as a rule of thumb, we don't girdle we girdle beyond 2 times the height of the tree, just in case it does fall over, it doesn't go beyond a burn unit boundary, or it doesn't hit any values at risks or structures or things like that. So you want to make sure if you're going to girdle that you do it well away from either a place that's valuable to you or where people are going to hang out, or a burn unit boundary. And so some situations like we saw before, if you girdle with a chainsaw and you're girdling smaller diameter trees and you go too deep into the holding wood, this is what happens within 3 or 4 years, or could happen. It doesn't take much to bring these trees down right where you girdled. And so now you're creating not only dead trees within your unit, but they're leaning trees, and they're even more of a hazard. So just a consideration. It probably would have been better to use an axe in this case. And then dying trees with red needles and snags within a burn unit may pose a risk of vertical fire spread and a holding concern. They may need to be pre-treated to exclude fire, or maybe wetted down or raked around or something, but something you might have to mitigate. And then also what we've seen is if you girdle a large group of trees, they can produce a stress crop, resulting in a dense crop of conifers. And this actually hinders fire spread by eliminating any small grasses or things that might carry fire. You have a live fuel there now that hinders fire spread. So again, another consideration, if you let too much light in the stand, this could happen. So I wanted to show you a couple of photos of a typical mechanical fuels project that we did some years ago. We have an oak woodland that with advanced encroachment with Douglas fir. And so I've got a CAL FIRE crew taking down the Doug fir outside of the stand and creating piles. And then as they get closer to those oaks is when you encounter trees, conifers that are growing up into the oaks that we can't bring to the ground, and so they're good candidates for girdling. And so this is post-treatment. You can see the amount of biomass that was created from this project, and you can see the trees that were girdled that we couldn't get to the ground. Either they were hung up or they were beyond the skill level of the crew members. But this is a nice finished product for us. And then to complete the project, we burned this unit about 4 years later. You can see what the piles look like. They lost a lot of their needles, but they're still receptive to fire. And it cleaned up really nicely along the oak woodland edge. And so we got good fire spread within the oak woodlands, and that's exactly what we want. So some of the lessons learned, we talked about when to girdle and then where not to girdle. Some of the response you might get in the understory, the long-term hazards by girdling and the fuels buildup possibly, but the wildlife benefits to girdling are definitely there. And then girdling is definitely a part of your mix of treatments appropriate for prepping a burn unit or just doing oak woodland restoration. Hey, thanks for watching. Appreciate it.